Our story does not begin on a swampy peninsula in Virginia, but in the teeming, ambitious, and often brutal world of Elizabethan and Jacobean England. It is a time of burgeoning empire, of daring sea dogs like Drake and Raleigh, and of a burning desire to pluck the fruits of the New World from the grasp of their Spanish rivals. The air is thick with tales of gold, of a passage to the Orient, of fountains of youth, and of a land so rich that a man might simply scoop its treasures from the ground. The Virginia Company, a joint stock enterprise, was the engine of this particular dream. It was a creature of commerce and national pride. In December of 1606, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, slipped their moorings on the Thames and headed for the open sea. They carried 104 men and boys, a cargo of hope, ambition, and a fair measure of human folly. Think of them, if you will. Not the rugged pioneers of myth, but a mixed bag, gentlemen unused to manual labor, soldiers seeking glory, craftsmen hoping for a new start, and a few boys along for the adventure. Their leader was Captain Christopher Newport, a seasoned mariner. But the true soul of the expedition, the man who would become its most controversial and enigmatic figure, was Captain John Smith. A soldier of fortune, a man scarred by battles in Transylvania, his gaze held the glint of one who had seen too much and trusted little. He was, by all accounts, boastful, ambitious, and possessed of an uncanny will to survive. He was exactly the kind of man such a venture needed, and exactly the kind of man who would make powerful enemies. The voyage itself was a trial. For long months at sea, cramped in wooden shells, battered by storms, with only the sun and stars to guide them. Can you imagine the conversations in the dark? The whispered fears, the boastful predictions, the quiet prayers? They were sailing not just across an ocean, but into the collective imagination of their age, a realm populated by both golden cities and monstrous men. On April 26, 1607, after a particularly violent storm, they finally sighted land. The capes they named Henry and Charles, after the king's sons. They entered the Great Bay, which they called Chesapeake, in honor of the king. The land before them was a profound and unsettling wilderness. It was not the manicured countryside of England. It was a vast, breathing, green entity, teeming with life they did not understand. The air was thick with the scent of pine and loam, and the silence was broken by the calls of unfamiliar birds and, from the shadows of the forest, the unseen rustle of things that watched. Their first contact with the native people was a stark warning. At a place they named Cape Henry, a group of Chesapeake Indians attacked them, wounding 2. A musket shot scattered them, but the message was clear: they were not welcome. This was not an empty land waiting to be claimed. It was someone else's home. For 2 weeks, they explored the river they named for their king, the James. They were looking for a place to plant their colony, a place that must satisfy 2 crucial, contradictory needs. It must be far enough inland to be safe from Spanish raids, and yet have deep water for their ships to moor. What they found, and what they chose, remains one of the most debated decisions in colonial history. On May 14, 1607, they sailed their ships up to a low-lying, marshy peninsula about 50 miles from the mouth of the bay. It was connected to the mainland by only a narrow isthmus. It was, by any rational measure, a terrible place for a settlement. The soil was poor and swampy. The river water was brackish and undrinkable. It was a breeding ground for mosquitoes. And it was, unbeknownst to them, located in the heart of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy, a sophisticated alliance of some 30 Algonquian-speaking tribes. Why here? The official reason was strategic, a defensive position. But one can't help but wonder if a kind of collective madness had set in after 4 months at sea. Did the sight of solid ground, any ground, seem like a blessing? Was there a whisper of a rumor, a hidden map, that promised something beneath that malarial mud? The choice of Jamestown Island is the first great mystery, a decision that would doom half of them before the first year was out. They named it for their king. And in that single, fateful act of naming, they planted the seeds of an American genesis in the most inhospitable of soils. The first few months were a flurry of activity. They unloaded their ships, erected a flimsy palisade, and began to build a fort, a storehouse, and some crude shelters. But they were not farmers, they were adventurers. They spent more time searching for gold, which they did not find, than planting crops. They alienated the very people they should have sought as allies. The Native Americans, the Powhatan, watched them. Their paramount chief, Wahunsenkaw, known to the English as Powhatan, was a shrewd and powerful leader. He saw these pale, clumsy newcomers for what they were, potentially useful pawns in his own struggles with rival tribes, or a dangerous disease to be eradicated. At first, there was a tense, uneasy peace, punctuated by moments of trade and moments of violence. They traded corn for trinkets, beads, and copper. But the relationship was built on a foundation of mutual incomprehension. And then, the ships sailed away. Newport returned to England for more supplies, leaving the 104 settlers to their fate. The veneer of civilization began to peel away almost immediately. The gentlemen refused to work. Dissension festered. John Smith, with his relentless drive and his contempt for the idle, was soon at odds with the colony's council. He was even arrested for mutiny on the voyage over, and his position was precarious. The summer of 1607 brought the seasoning, a euphemism for the deadly wave of sickness that swept through the colony. Dysentery, typhoid, and salt poisoning from the river water took a horrific toll. Men died in their filth, one after another, their bodies buried in unmarked graves, lest the natives learn how weak they had become. By September, only 46 of the original 104 were alive. It was in this cauldron of desperation that the character of John Smith emerged. He began to take control. He made a now famous pronouncement: "He that will not work, shall not eat." He negotiated, bullied, and threatened the settlers into building proper shelters and digging a well. He also began a series of exploratory voyages up the Chickahominy and other rivers, seeking food and, perhaps, a passage to the South Sea. And it was on one of these voyages, in December of 1607, that the most enduring and mysterious event of the entire Jamestown saga occurred. Smith, with 2 English companions and 2 native guides, was deep in Powhatan territory. They were ambushed by a party of warriors led by Powhatan's kinsman, Opechancanough. Smith's companions were killed. Smith, expecting to die, fought back with characteristic ferocity, using his native guide as a shield, until he was overpowered by the sheer number of his attackers. He was taken on a ritualistic tour of the Powhatan villages, a kind of victory parade. Finally, he was brought to the great chief's capital, Werowocomoco, on the York River. There, in a longhouse filled with grim warriors and the silent, watchful women of the tribe, he was brought before Powhatan himself. What happened next is known to us primarily from Smith's own writings, published years later. He describes a grand feast, followed by a terrifying ordeal. Great stones were brought forth, and Smith's head was forced down upon them. The warriors raised their clubs to beat out his brains. And then, a girl stepped forward. Pocahontas, Powhatan's dearest daughter, a child of perhaps 10 or 11 years. According to Smith, she ran to him, took his head in her arms and laid her own upon his to save him from death. Powhatan, moved by his daughter's plea, relented. He adopted Smith as a son, or a subordinate chief, and sent him back to Jamestown with gifts. It is a beautiful story. A story of innocence taming savagery, of a bridge built between 2 worlds. It has become the central myth of Jamestown. But we are here to preserve the mystery, not to solve it. Did it happen exactly as Smith said? He was, after all, a master of self-promotion. He wrote his general history of Virginia years later, long after Pocahontas had become a celebrity in London. He is the only source for the story. Pocahontas herself never spoke of it publicly. Many historians believe it was not a near execution at all, but a ritual of adoption, a complex piece of Powhatan theater that Smith, in his European mindset, completely misunderstood. Perhaps the entire scene was a performance, a symbolic death and rebirth, to make Smith a subordinate werowance, a chief loyal to Powhatan. The saving by Pocahontas may have been a preordained part of the ritual, a gesture of mercy and acceptance. Or perhaps it was a genuine, spontaneous act of a child's compassion. We will never know. What we do know is that this moment, whatever its true nature, forged a strange and tenuous link between the fort on the swamp and the chiefdom on the York. Pocahontas became a frequent visitor to Jamestown, a messenger, a trader, a bringer of food in times of desperate hunger. She was a playful figure, cartwheeling through the fort with the boys, a bridge between two worlds that could not comprehend one another. But she was also a symbol of the profound mystery at the heart of the encounter. Who was she, really? A diplomatic envoy? A curious child? A spy? The shadow of that longhouse, with the clubs raised high, will forever obscure the truth. The year 1608 was one of fragile survival. More ships arrived, bringing more mouths to feed, but also the supplies that kept the colony from utter collapse. Smith, now president of the council, ruled with an iron hand. He forced the men to work, to plant crops, to strengthen the palisade. He led more expeditions to trade with the native villages, often using a combination of bravado and barter. He understood, perhaps better than any of them, that their survival depended on the goodwill, or at least the fear, of the Powhatan. And through it all, Pocahontas came and went. She brought food when Smith threatened to burn villages. She warned him of ambushes. She was a vital, unpredictable, and deeply human element in a world of suspicion and violence. She was the conscience, the go-between, the living embodiment of the possibility of peace. But the relationship with Powhatan was a careful dance on a knife's edge. The English wanted food and, ultimately, submission. Powhatan wanted English tools, weapons, and metal, but he wanted the troublesome strangers gone. He played a long game, feeding them just enough to keep them alive, but not enough to make them strong. It was a policy of strategic starvation. In the autumn of 1608, Captain Newport returned with orders from the Virginia Company to crown Powhatan as a sub-king of England, presenting him with a gaudy bedstead and a copper crown. It was a catastrophic act of cultural blindness. Smith knew it would be seen as an insult. The ceremony, held at Werowocomoco, was a farce. Powhatan refused to kneel, and the English had to practically force the crown onto his head. He responded by offering his old cloak and a pair of his worn moccasins to be sent back to King James. The message was clear: we are equals. The respect that had been carefully cultivated was squandered in an afternoon. The fragile peace began to crack. By the summer of 1609, Powhatan stopped trading. He laid siege to the fort, forbidding his people from selling the English any food. The colonists, who still had not learned to grow enough for themselves, were trapped. And then, in a moment of terrible irony, John Smith was removed from the equation. A mysterious gunpowder explosion in his canoe severely burned his legs. He was in agony, unable to lead. In October of 1609, he was shipped back to England for medical treatment. He would never see Virginia again. And Pocahontas, we are told, was told he was dead. With Smith gone, the colony lost its anchor. The council that took over was weak and divided. And then, the winter came. It was not an ordinary winter. It was the worst in a century. The rivers froze. The game disappeared. The natives, sensing the colonists' desperation, tightened their siege. The English, huddled inside their rotting palisade, had nothing. They ate their shoes, their leather jackets. They ate their horses, then their dogs, then their cats, then their rats. They boiled and ate the starch from their collars. And then, in the ultimate, unspeakable act of desperation, they turned to the dead. This was the starving time, the winter of 1609 to 1610. Of the 500 or so people who had been in the colony by the fall, only 60 survived until spring. The living were so weak they could barely bury the dead. They dug up corpses for sustenance. One man, a Jamestown resident, was executed for killing his wife and eating her, having salted her flesh. The archaeological evidence, unearthed centuries later, confirms this grim chapter, the bones of a 14-year-old girl, showing the unmistakable cut marks of butchering. Jamestown, in that winter, was not a colony. It was a vision of hell on earth, a place where the thin crust of civilization had utterly collapsed, revealing the raw, primal horror beneath. The dream of a new world had curdled into a nightmare of starvation and cannibalism. When Sir Thomas Gates, the new governor, arrived in May of 1610, he found a scene of utter devastation, a world of woes. The survivors were little more than skeletons, the fort in ruins. He decided there was no choice but to abandon the colony, to sail for Newfoundland and hope for passage home. As the survivors sailed down the James River, their hearts heavy with defeat, they met a longboat coming up the river. It was Lord de la Warr, the new governor, arriving with 3 ships laden with supplies and 150 new settlers. They turned around. Jamestown would not be abandoned. It would cling to life, surviving on a knife's edge, its future still uncertain. The story of Jamestown's founding is not a simple one. It is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written upon, erased, and written upon again. The mysteries remain. We will never know the true thoughts of the men who chose that malarial swamp. We will never know the full truth of what happened in Powhatan's longhouse. We will never be able to fully comprehend the depths of the horror of that winter, or the desperate calculus that led a man to eat his own wife. And we can only wonder at the mind of Pocahontas, the girl who danced between 2 worlds, a symbol of hope in a time of unspeakable brutality, who would later be taken captive, converted to Christianity, married to an Englishman, and taken to London as a curiosity, where she would die at the age of 21, far from the forests of her home. Jamestown was a place where the boundaries blurred. Between hope and despair. Between civilization and savagery. Between history and myth. Its founding was not a clean, heroic act of nation-building. It was a messy, terrifying, and profoundly human venture into the unknown. And in that mess, in that terror, in that humanity, lies its enduring mystery. The echoes of those first desperate years still whisper from the tidewater, if only we have the ears to listen. Friends, if you are interested in the true history of the United States without embellishment, subscribe to the Empire of Freedom channel. Click on the bell so you don't miss anything.